trigger happy and I give less than a fuck. Love me or hate me, I'ma show enough, rip shit up. It's Mr. Nothing, nice on a mic stand. Mic in the left and the zest in my right hand. I took a puff, had enough now, hold up. If that was Indo, niggas getting rolled up.
What's going on, folks? This is Acid Roots. So I'm going to review the second Panic at the Disco album, Pretty Odd. Now, this came out in the spring of 2008, and basically they took a little bit of time off after their Fever You Can't Sweat Out project from 2005. Like, if Fever You Can't Sweat Out had a more dramatic and kind of speech and debate kind of vibe, where you kind of have like a more sense of like drama to it, I kind of feel like this project kind of was like a lot more mellow and lackadaisical. This didn't really have the emo MySpace feel of Fever You Can't Sweat Out. It didn't seem like it was kind of like, didn't feel like it was an extra appendage of like American Idiot by Green Day and the Fall Out Boy records and that type of stuff. And really, it's pretty distant from like some of those. It's not completely, but it has like it's at least got more standing on its own 2 feet and more independence than it did on Fever You Can't Sweat Out. And that's not to say it was bad, because as it were, I still like Fever You Can't Sweat Out better than this record. It is the swirl of things that they were trying to do and the aesthetic for that. I feel like that one had the better appeal and more provocative and more overall enthralling kind of character. But this, I mean, really, for me to question as to whether or not this would have been popular in like the alternative scene and things like Hot Topic and, you know, those type stores, more alternative and goth stores and that type of stuff, I think it probably would have, but I just don't think it would have been like first notation. It probably would have been a very secondary or tertiary mention of something like that, just because it tries like some real kind of Beatles-esque things, and a lot of these songs on this album are really kind of nothing like the stuff that they did on their first project. And it's kind of like, I didn't understand why. I mean, so some of these songs, in my opinion, are so bad that it's like you don't even try to actually listen to them the whole way through, because they're so outlandish and they don't have any sort of melody for the direction that they were trying to do. It's like, I mean, in some cases, like to have respect for like folks like the Beatles and the Beach Boys and bands from like the 60s and that kind of vibe. But the unfortunate thing is that the instrumentation that those groups use, it wasn't exactly as if there were emo folks and goth folks running around back in 1961 and stuff. And I kind of feel like, to talk about it like that, it's not so much that they had to be typecast, but I look after it. It's the main situation is the instrumentations, and like the stuff that they do in these songs do not feel like any sort of match. I mean, I feel like the color coding that this album tries to have is pretty poor. It just doesn't make sense. It's like, yeah, we're just going to make this. If we want to have like brass instruments with like wind instruments and blah 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 and these type things, a bassoon with like a tuba or something like that, it just, I mean, it doesn't really have like the sensibility of any sort of match, and just a bunch of things. The singles are at least intact, but I still feel like they're still off the wall, but we'll go ahead and get to that. So keep in mind that there was an album that was Panic at the Disco was actually going to come back in 2007, and they had a prior album that was going to be called Cricket and Clover. But just hearing and learning information about that really makes me wonder if that would have been like the true sequel to Fever You Can't Sweat Out. Not that this record is bad, Pretty Odd is bad that much entirely, but I wonder if they would have developed a sequel to Fever You Can't Sweat Out with the more drama and kind of kind of alternative emphasis that it had the last time. I wonder the songs that would have happened. But they scrapped that album, Cricket and Clover, and the first song that they put out, as like, I want to say that this was even a leftover from Cricket and Clover, was 9 in the Afternoon. Now this sounds like But It's Better If You Do. That's kind of, it has that same kind of vibe from some of the later singles, like yeah, I think it was But It's Better If You Do from Fever You Can't Sweat Out. That sounds very similar to, sounds like you're getting ready to have a night out. Kind of sounds like you got a date in like an hour and a half, something like that. Some sort of vibe of just getting ready to kind of go out and enjoy yourself. I mean, I could still see myself sipping a beer and kind of kicking back to this sort of song and having a good time. it is a social type vibe towards it and has a nice outgoing festiveness, but it just kind of feels like in a hurry. And then on top of that, it also feels kind of glum. I mean, all the singles on this project have this real kind of almost like depressed malaise to them, and they kind of feel like they're spiffy, but they're not really in the mood to be spiffy. And I think the concept is kind of like putting on a smile for some reason when you're really not in that hot of a mood. And that's kind of still be expecting to go out when you're really just wanting to just lay on your back in bed and that type stuff. So I kind of look after it, and that's kind of the context for a lot of these singles. And they just don't have the energy of But It's Better If You Do and I Write Sins Not Tragedies, and the only difference between Suicide and Martyrdom is press coverage. I mean, those had like ferocious energy and just a lot more spark to them, and it felt as if like they were ready to have like 3 concerts in one day and just go out and flirt with like 5 or 6 women, that type stuff. But it just kind of felt, like I said, a just more mellow malaise to it. But Mad Rabbits, to me, this song kind of felt like ballroom disco. I don't know how much that, maybe you haven't heard that phrase before, but it kind of felt like some ballroom disco. That's the closest thing to like a dance song like on the previous album. They at least attempted it, but it's kind of short lived. This is like the only real project with any real spunk, or the only real song with any spunk in terms of like what they did before. But they at least gave it the effort to kind of have, but it's not electro and techno like it was on their 2005 album. So it's just, like I said, ballroom disco. Kind of feels like a dance number, but just real kind of like from the 1950s or early 60s, something like that. This off the wall and kind of feels out of character for them, but they pulled it off. I mean, I'll give them credit. They pulled it off, and Brendan Urie is very melodic, and he is a good vocalist. I do appreciate he's easy to listen to, so that's another thing. That Green Gentleman is another kind of song, kind of similar to like the singles that they did with A Fever, or not, the only difference, and then I Write Sins Not Tragedies. I feel like 9 in the Afternoon and That Green Gentleman are kind of the same 1-2 punch vibe of the first 2 singles from A Fever You Can't Sweat Out. They both kind of have this outgoing, ready to go out for the night, kind of got a date in like an hour and a half vibe. Like this is kind of the sequel. I feel like That Green Gentleman is kind of the sequel to 9 in the Afternoon. Same kind of outgoing vibe, just kind of mellow, not real heavy on like the riffs and stuff, just kind of in a more sense of you got a drink in your hand, and you know that tonight's going to be good, but it's not really something that's in the midst of the night. It's kind of like where it's like, yeah, it's getting ready to happen, but you're just kind of kicking back on standby until it does happen. But it's a good song. These are the kind of songs I wish that the whole album had, because it's just charming, the emphasis behind it, and it still shows that Panic at the Disco has personality. And then Northern Downpour was kind of like a real kind of plain pop rock ballad. It just felt really depressed, and it felt like a song that you would listen to like in a movie when like the hero screws up and it's raining and like his girlfriend leaves him and all that type stuff, and he almost gets fired from his job. Those kind of vibes is what it felt like. This kind of typical movie soundtrack. The I don't remember what that point is called in the movie, but like the clash in the movie where the bad stuff starts happening. It's a decent song. I mean, I respect sad songs because there are moments for those type of songs, but this was really kind of a change of tempo, and it's surprising that they went with that as a single. So, but they're all good. I liked all 4 of the singles, despite the fact that they were different from A Fever You Can't Sweat Out. I still felt like they had like a lot of good emphasis, and they were just off the wall. They were a lot more left field, barely felt alternative, but they still somehow pulled it off. I feel like that, like I said, I feel like they went from primary alternative to maybe secondary and even like tertiary alternative, just to where it kind of feels like you have to look deeper to kind of see folks that might have been fans of this project. That's the vibe I got from it, but I kind of feel like, yeah, I mean, the singles were good, but they just felt a lot more kind of subdued this time around. That's kind of the situation, because I could tell, because the singles off this project, there was nothing as large as I Write Sins Not Tragedies. So it really felt like this project just kind of came and went. But So yeah, unfortunately, there's not much noteworthy to really speak of on this project. I mean, there just were how many songs I knew I probably wouldn't listen to. The piano knows something I don't know. Behind the sea, folking around from a mountain in the middle of the cabins. I mean, a lot of these. I have friends in holy spaces. I mean, some of these just really kind of. I mean, they don't have quite as long of titles as they did on their first album, but some of these just feel like songs that's like, why am I listening to this? They feel like kind of random house cleaning, like someone that's 20 years older or 35 years older than the audience that they had on the first album. They went from making songs who were for people who were like 19 and 22 to making songs who were making songs for people who were like 46 and 55 or something. And it just kind of felt like, I mean, I know it's good to expand the audience, but I felt like they didn't quite pull it off in terms of like what was interesting. I mean, they're not the Beatles, and it's not like that's a bad thing, but just the concept of it trying to be like the kind of hazy and or trying to be like the hazy kind of psychedelic vibe of like the Beatles. And it's not like, I don't know. I mean, it's not like they couldn't have pulled it off. And well, I felt like that just wasn't their swing. I feel like that's kind of the main thing about it, just because the personality behind that didn't match up, just because surely of the instrumentation and the way that some of that stuff went. It just was not a very easy listen to go through some of these songs, and you could tell that every single song that wasn't a single. And it's just like, okay, Northern Downpour, good song. Other songs, bad songs. It was just the difference. You could just tell that any song that wasn't a single was a bad song. And really, I felt like the only real song that had any sort of creative instrumentation in terms of something enthralling and head bobbing to listen to was just She's a Handsome Woman. That had a pretty like appreciative beat and production on there, and I felt like it was just an overall charming listen. There should have been like at least 4 or 5 more songs like this. I mean, there's 15 songs on here, but there's just not enough partially to really partially to really say that it's worth the charm. I mean, I kind of was faced with this problem in a lighter sense on A Fever You Can't Sweat Out, where they kind of struggled to develop album cuts, but they really have this problem on this project. I liked 4 singles, all 4 of the singles, and then 1 album cut, and then that was virtually it. I mean, for the most part, this album is pretty much bunk beyond that. There's just nothing noteworthy. I can't think of any reason why you would listen to this. Going from 9 in the Afternoon to some of the album cuts on here, 9 in the Afternoon, which is a good cut, to like some of these just kind of awkward, I don't know, like I can't even think of reasons why you would listen to it, like doing laundry, taking out the trash. I mean, there's just no real reason to even pick these songs up. I mean, music, usually there's a reason for it. You go out, you flirt, you dance, you smoke, that type of stuff, but there's not, you drive, but there's not any sort of like any, I can't really think of the situations. I mean, the more you listen to these, the less they have like the just the reason behind it. I mean, maybe I'm kind of generalizing, but the way I listened to this project, I just could not find much of anything noteworthy and anything charming that had the punch of like 9 in the Afternoon and That Green Gentleman. And those are just some of the best moments. There should have been more songs like that. They just should have had a more outgoing and just more spark in their kind of like mood. It just felt like a lot of these were just kind of sad, kind of somber, and not in an interesting way somber kind of moments. And it's just not a very charming listen, but they did it in the singles. That's kind of the situation. So I'm going to give this album, I'll go ahead and tell you the songs. I'll go ahead and stress to you the 5 songs out of 15 I recommend. So that would be That Green Gentleman, 9 in the Afternoon, She's a Handsome Woman, Northern Downpour, and Mad as Rabbits. So me only liking 5 out of 15, I'm going to give this album a 3.5 out of 10. I'm just going to say I could give it a 4. I'll give it a 4. I'll give it a 4 out of 10 just because, an E for effort in terms of what they did. The singles were a lot of fun, and I didn't expect them to pull it off just because I read about this album before I listened to it, and they said it was a drastic departure from A Fever You Can't Sweat Out, and it's really not that bad of a difference. It's not that stark of a difference. It's just the main fact is the mood has changed and the emphasis of just the direction that they went. I mean, it's still kind of in a light sense alternative, but it's kind of Like it's to me, it was more like this the character. This it was more their kind of mindset in this project that kind of was different, and that's kind of the situation. I mean, they didn't do a ladies song this time. There was a song. I guess I'll look at it and see. Lying is the most fun a girl can have. Yeah, they didn't do a song like that this time. They didn't do a song like Lying is the most fun a girl can have. It wasn't quite as romantic this time around. Didn't have a song like that, but they did have two outgoing songs. They did have a kind of sad ballad, and they did kind of have like an electro pop or a disco, ballroom disco song like Mad as Rabbits. But it really, they toned down the flirting this time around. No real kind of spicy, kind of flirtatious, kind of dissonance that they had on the first album. So it's not quite as spicy this time, but still has the outgoingness in a light sense. It's just very light. It's not all over the project like it was kind of last time, or at least had the energy of it. So 4 out of 10, and I would have to say the social score I will give like a 5.5 out of 10 because it did have 4 singles. 2 of them were pretty outgoing. 3 of them were actually pretty outgoing, but that's really all there is to this project. There's not like much that I could say, like any emphasis. I mean, a lot of this just kind of feels like ingratiating to listen to. It's not real, there's no album cuts that you can say, hey, that's a nice song, minus She's a Handsome Woman. So it's just kind of lots of fluff on here that didn't need to be on here, and they just should have sparked up their mood and cheered up a bit. That's like the main thing. But so the future, I just learned recently that Panic at the Disco is going to drop an album in August of 2022, which kicks ass. I hope that it's full of spark, and I am interested to see the direction that they're going to take for it. But we should see what happens there. But this is a decent album. It's worth a purchase, but there's just not much beyond the singles at all.